This is the Power Break Podcast number 238, titled Naming Names. Hi, everyone. I'm Bob Brubaker, along with JT, as we hope you'll stay tuned as we seek to give you a little power in this break to help you succeed in the race of life.
This is the Power Break Podcast with a focus on the spiritual, the mental, and the physical aspects, all to help you succeed in the race of life. For show notes from today's podcast, go to bobbrubaker.com and follow the link for the Power Break Podcast. You know, before we get into thanking our listeners, because they certainly deserve it, man, this title fascinated me when I first read it. I'm like, man, where's he going with this? So I'm super excited for this podcast.
Oh, cool, JT. Well, it's good to have you back in the saddle as far as back at home, even though while you were on the road, somehow, because of the modern technology, folks, we can sound like we're together, although he was in Rhode Island and I was here in Florida. And here we are. Wherever you are, you're listening by way of the internet, and we appreciate it very much. But thankfully, JT, you made it back home safely.
That's right. Yeah, the trip was good. It was very productive. I got to spend some time with my aunt who's recovering from a surgery. So, yeah, it was really good. Yeah, and that modern technology, man, never ceases to amaze me.
I was wondering if one day we could do it while you drive, but I don't know if we could do that.
I already know my luck, man. I'll end up pile driving myself into something by accident. The listeners, and we don't edit, so the listeners could hear the whole thing.
Yeah. So, what? By the way, what kind of training are you doing these days? Is it full of mud up there still, or what's going on?
Yeah. So, when I got back, the first thing I asked was, "Has it rained in the past 2 days?" And they said no. I'm like, interesting, because it's been above freezing for several days. So I was like, it should be okay. Sure enough, there was only parts of the trails that were muddy. So I got 2 really good rides in Monday and Tuesday. And now it's starting to go below freezing again. So I just have to make sure that I go before it starts to warm up, which would be miserable for you, my friend, because I know how much you dislike cold. But if I get out and it's still like 28 degrees and it's still frozen from the night before, and I don't have to worry too much about mud.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, so it's all just, making sure you bide your time correctly, my friend.
Yeah, well, this is what they call the base season anyway, right? Where you're not supposed to really put out a lot of physical activity because the year will progress. So anyway, the reason I don't like the cold, folks, is because I have a lung condition, and as soon as I go out in the cold, my lungs don't cooperate at all.
They shut her down. Yes, I have seen it myself.
I go. It looks like I'm a 10-pound weakling, but there you go. I'm glad to be alive.
A 10-pound weakling, whatever. Says the guy who does century rides all the time. I don't even want to hear it.
All right. Well, it's time on the podcast to thank the listeners. Why don't you take off with it, JT? You do a good job with that.
Yeah, every single time Bob and I discuss how many people are downloading, how many people are listening, it just blows us away. We really appreciate it, and we're so thankful that you guys get something out of it. Speaking of which, if you do get something out of it, it would really help other people find the podcast if you gave us a 5-star rating or wrote a good review or did both, because that helps them find us, right, Bob?
It really does, and also just by word of mouth or by word of your text or email, however it is, we appreciate getting the word out about the Power Break Podcast. JT, today we're talking about naming names. You said that you had great interest as you looked at that title, and I sent you the notes here. But what comes to your mind when you think about naming names?
I must admit, first and foremost, I didn't know what you were talking about when I just read the title. I'm like, what is he talking about? So, obviously, I figured it out as I read through the script, and I understood exactly what you were saying. And it really just talks about our accountability for our mouth, really. A lot of us just get so out of control with the negativity or, not being confrontational with people as far as, and I think the word confrontational has gotten a bad rap because all that means is really looking the truth in the eyes. So confronting things is not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. But how many times have I heard people, I'm really just not confrontational, i.e., I don't love you enough to tell you the truth to your face. That's what that translates to.
That is exactly it. Yeah.
So, naming names is when you're physically talking bad about somebody else before you, or their behavior, before you even honor them enough to go to them and talk to them about it. But if they basically tell you to buzz off, then that's a different story. But we owe that, number one. Scripture says we should do it. But really, if you think about it, that really helps us stay connected instead of alienating one another, right?
That's exactly right. When you start just pointing the finger and telling others about how bad this other person is, you're not doing anything to restore a relationship. You're actually building a bigger ditch between the two of you. So that's important. Well, today we are talking about naming names. There is a process for naming names of those who have done you wrong. You don't just take it to the internet. The Apostle Paul confronted Peter to his face. It was only after that Paul wrote to the Galatians about the situation, because it had been reconciled between the two. Here's how it goes. It says, when Cephas, who is Peter, came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. The rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas, Peter, before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews? So he was naming names in the account, but he understand Peter had done wrong. He pointed it out to Peter, and Peter made a reconciliation so that there was not the rift between them. So when he's talking to the Gentile, or to the Galatian churches there about this situation, was because they had heard about it. And so he was naming names. He was talking about Peter, but notice he wasn't talking derogatorily. So he was talking about Peter and how he confronted him because there was a mistake there. He was not living up to what the standards of the gospel was. So he was he was going wish-washy back and forth. And so when he was confronted by Paul, it was reconciled, and that was the end of it. Okay, so Paul could talk about it in teaching the lesson, but it also teaches the lesson what you do when you face confrontation from someone else, or they need confrontation. So what we're talking about today is naming names.
Yeah, let's continue to talk more about that as we turn to your blog. Folks, if you haven't been over to BobBrubaker.com, make sure you get over there and check it out. If you're a telemarketer, I am no longer interested in any of your emails, by the way, at jt@bobbrubaker.com. Just saying, man, gosh, it's like every time I open it, I'm like all excited, and I'm like, oh, man, this is some dude like trying to be a publisher for your books or something, which I get, but that's not what we want, folks. I want questions, which I actually think that we have one that we're going to answer today, so I'm super excited about it. But anyway, get over to BobBrubaker.com. At the very least, sign up for the blog. It'll show up every Monday and get you prepared for the Power Break podcast. But let's continue to talk more about naming names.
Well, as I wrote in the article, that we'll all be offended in one way, shape, or form. That's for sure. And what we do when we are offended is the important piece of the situation. Most people today take to the internet and name names describing the awful thing that was done to them. But hold on a second now. There is a process. In due time, naming names may be the proper thing to do, but not right off the bat. First things first, go to the offender, says the Lord Jesus Christ. Go to the offender to seek reconciliation before you do anything else, including and especially the internet. Notice the purpose of reconciliation is not to let the person have a piece of your mind. It says, Matthew chapter 18 and verse 15, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault. Okay, as you mentioned, JT, this is confrontation. Go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained the brother. So you go and tell him his fault for the purpose of reconciliation, not for the purpose of saying, you low down scum of the earth.
That's not why I'm doing it. That's how it feels half the time, which is why I just wait until I don't feel that way before I do it. But go ahead.
Oh, well, now that is a good point, JT. Yes, do not react when you're feeling the heat of the time.
No.
Cool down before you make this attempt. But the second attempt is also important because in the spirit of reconciliation, the next verse says you take 2 or 3 people along with you to the second meeting. This does not mean you're going to gang up on the person. Rather, you as the offended are reaching out to the offender for the purpose of reconciliation, and the people you brought with you are simply witnesses. Matthew 18, verse 16. If he does not listen, this is the guy that did the offense, take 2 or 3 others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 to 3 witnesses. Thirdly, then, you bring it to the church, again, for the purpose of reconciliation, that maybe the person will hear what the church has to say. And in Matthew 18, verse 17, says, if he refuses to listen to them, that is the 2 to 3 witnesses, tell it to the church, and if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. In other words, that was excommunication there. Fourthly, if the person will not hear the counsel of the church, that's when Jesus says that person should be named as a person who rejects the truth, because he says in verse 17 of Matthew 18, if he refuses to listen to them, even to the church, he refuses to listen to the church, let him be as a Gentile or tax collector. Now, it was upon the counsel that Paul took to naming names so that people would understand that a person who has rejected the truth, and as a result, he should be considered a person that cannot be trusted. That's where he says in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 16, avoid irreverent babble, for it will lead people into more and more ungodliness, and their talk to spread like gangrene. Among them, notice he names names here, Hymenaeus and Philetus. It's obvious that he had spent time trying to straighten out, but they were sowing bad seed in the church, and so he's naming names. He says they've swerved from the truth, saying the resurrection has already happened, and they're upsetting the faith of some. Obviously, he's very upset about it. In chapter 4 of 2 Timothy, he lists Demas, he says, who's in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. And so he names Demas. Can you imagine being in the church where there was Demas, and then all of a sudden Paul's naming names? Whoa!
Yeah.
We've got a letter from Paul here, folks. Let's read it. Wait a minute. Demas has, has deserted me.
Not good.
Yeah. But anyway, the naming of names, the Apostle Paul, he named some people like Hymenaeus and Alexander, and also Cretans and others that had done wrong by sowing bad seeds. But he also named names on the other hand. The other people that caused not problems in the church, but people that were a blessing to the church. Notice in Romans chapter 16, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a servant worthy of the church at Cenchrea, that you may welcome her in the Lord and worthy of the saints. Help her in whatever she may need of you. Also greet Priscilla and Aquila, my fellow workers in the Lord Jesus Christ. He goes on to talk about greet Epaphras, and also greet Mary, and also others, including the people that were very special to him. If you look at the last part of Romans chapter 16, you see all these names, and they just, one after another, that these people were very special to the Apostle Paul.
Right.
So names are important, and so naming names before you bring down a person, statements of defaming their name, remember there's a process to go through before you think of doing that, but naming people who are a blessing, well, that's right anytime. Just like my good friend, John Trabino, a.k.a. JT.
That's so funny, man. You know, number one, I appreciate it. And, you know, I don't ever worry about you naming names without you and I discussing it. So that's certainly never been an issue, has it?
No.
But, you know, it's so interesting to me that in Matthew, he basically talks about excommunication, and he talks about, you know, treat them like a Gentile or a tax collector. And it's so fascinating to me because Matthew was a tax collector.
Isn't that something? Yeah.
It's insane. Yeah. Like that just punches you right in the face. That's Matthew knowing who he is in Christ, being able to write about that and who he was before that.
Excellent point. Yeah. So he puts that in the account there. And Matthew, the tax collectors were known as publicans, not republicans, but they were
Right.
publicans. And that was the word they were used for. It was a very derogatory term that they were a tax collector.
That's right.
because as tax collectors, they were supposed to collect taxes from people. But the more that they collected over the amount, that was theirs. That's how they got paid.
Yeah, it's
So
crazy.
if you owed $20 and I convinced you that you owed $40, I give the $20 to the government, but I keep the other 20.
Wow, you mean that the tax code wasn't fair even back then? It's amazing.
The tax code probably wasn't fair from the time of Joseph in the Old Testament. It was
Yeah.
20% back then.
Yeah, you're probably right. So, number one, that was a great article. And the naming of names is something that we're very guilty of, and we're very guilty of doing it without doing
Due
any
process.
confrontation.
Yeah.
Due process is that's the perfect term. Due process. It's if you think it's important to name a name, these are the things that you better do first. And this is how you make sure that you don't lose a friend through the making of a point. And that's what we do all the time. We lose friends
Yeah.
trying to make a point and using them their name in a negative way when we don't have the right to unless we've talked to them about that. Yeah.
You're right, JT, and I think that it's important, like, as you mentioned, before you even respond, that you cool down a bit, because sometimes in the heat of things, we misinterpret. That's the bad thing about text or emails.
So true.
That you don't know the feeling behind it. But isn't it interesting that we've gone to that? Even in longer discourses, people will put in a long text that goes on for pages and pages and pages, and we don't get the feeling behind that. I mean, wouldn't it be better just to actually push the call button and call the person?
Yeah, it would, because how you know this because you are a really smart guy. How much of nonverbal communication, or how much of communication is nonverbal? That's the right question.
Yeah.
I mean, it's literally almost 90%. It's like 88% of all communication between us is nonverbal. And there's so many people that have lost the cues and what they mean. It's funny, when I communicate by text, I really go out of my way to send an emoji that almost like lets them know how I'm feeling. Like if I'm smiling or laughing or, and it's so odd that we're to that point. It's probably, I don't even have to say probably. I know it's not healthy, but
I need you to come and give me a lesson in emojis.
Oh, I can definitely do that. Yeah, I got some good ones. Oh, and by the way, that brown one that has eyes on it, but it kind of almost looks like ice cream. It's not ice cream, just so you know.
Oh, I'm not sure, but I know what you're talking about. But I do know this. I was at a meeting the other night. Okay, this was a meeting for our presbytery. We were meeting over in Tampa, and the question was, do we want to go to part of our meetings done electronically? Okay. No. Everybody said no. And of course, the guy that was pressing for that couldn't make it to the meeting that night, and he came in by Zoom. Okay. So we're all sitting there at the table, but of course, nobody could see him but a couple people because of the computer that was doing the Zoom. But it was interesting throughout the evening, even though he was not there for a whole lot of the meeting, that it dropped 3 or 4 times, and we didn't really know what he was saying. And of course, what you're saying is that we also didn't see the body language.
No, that's the biggest part. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I used to, I took a class that was called Kinetic Interview. And basically, it was about using the information that people had given you kinetically, i.e., body language, nonverbal stuff, to determine kind of where they're at, whether they're telling you the truth, whether they're not. And let me tell you, without that, a good interview on somebody is impossible. If you aren't in person, like if I was interviewing you right now for a crime, I'm not going to get anything from you over the video. Number one, you're going to feel like powerful in a false way because you're far away from me, right? I can't physically touch you. I can't get closer to you. I can't do any of those things. So yeah, it's super important, and I think we really use that or lose that for sure. So really, the confrontation needs to be in person, doesn't it, too, Bob?
It really does.
Yep.
And that's why, and the whole purpose, before you even go to confront a person, is for reconciliation, that you want to help the situation out by restoring a friendship.
Yeah,
And
that's right.
And so that's important. Anyway, the name of the article is called Naming Names. You'll find it at bobbrubaker.com.
So what's happening, Bob? Anything you want the listeners to know about this week?
All throughout this month, we're talking about Relief in Suffering, the book that I published last year at this time. And it is a book about relief in suffering taken from the book of James, chapter 5. God has provided for us. I mean, sometimes we think that we should be instantly be relieved of our suffering, that we don't go through it. Actually, God says, here's how you go through it, and here's what to do, and offers some relief and hope for us in that time of suffering. The book is called Relief in Suffering. You'll find it at bobbrubaker.com. Scroll through the books, or through the resources to the books, and through the books, you'll find it, Relief in Suffering. And while you're there at bobbrubaker.com, check out the sermon links to the sermons I preach here at Christ Community Presbyterian Church in Clearwater, Florida. And right now going through a book of 2 Peter. And we're in the final stages through chapter 3, about 5 messages in chapter 3, dealing with the problems of people messing up eschatology.
Oh,
That's a big, long word, isn't it? Yeah.
And most people have no idea what that means, but go ahead.
Well, it's the study of the end times, okay? And so
Right.
what Peter is doing is pointing out that there are some people came in among them and taught some things that were not so, and so he's straightening it out. And so anyway, it's good stuff. Check it out, the sermon links and the books and everything else at bobbrubaker.com.
This is the Power Break Podcast. I'm JT along with Bob Brubaker, and this is time on the podcast for questions and answers. If you have a question for me or for Bob, feel free to email me at jt@bobbrubaker.com, and we'll get to answering that on an upcoming Power Break podcast. So, question number 1 from the spiritual side of life. Should we ever name names of those who have done us wrong?
Well, it's true, as that I pointed out in the article, how just naming names as people do today on the social media is really never appropriate. According to Jesus in Matthew 18, there was a process to go through which attempts at reconciliation are the primary reason for meeting. And when all is pushed away, only then is a person treated as an unbeliever, where names would be named. As far as the Apostle Paul pointing out names of those who had forsaken the faith, we don't know exactly all the details, but we can be pretty sure that Paul had labored with those individuals, even as he gives that admonition in the book of Galatians chapter 6. Nevertheless, as he labored with those individuals, and a person wasn't, he wasn't following those things, wouldn't leave the false doctrine. So he wasn't just taking pot shots at some people, but that he didn't like in particular, but or they rubbed him the wrong way. But he was pointing out to the church so they would be aware that there was error in that person, error that was going to be harmful to the church. So to answer the question, yes, naming names of those who have done us wrong should only be done after attempts at reconciliation by ourselves, as well as witnesses and the church. Then and then only do you have the right to name names, but never in a slanderous way. Would you agree to that?
No, I would agree with that completely. You know, and as a guy who had to discipline police officers, you know, if they went on a call and they said something inappropriate, which is the majority of what police officers make mistakes. You know, they get heated and they say something that probably isn't professional. I would actually argue that on top of police officers, that's where most of us have a tendency to get in trouble, is letting the mouth get out of control, right?
In the heat of the moment, you're talking about.
Yeah, that's right. And doing it, you know, letting somebody get under your skin, and next thing you know, you're doing something out of anger instead of out of love. So, but the biggest thing I would always get back, Bob, was people actually would say, well, such and such did this. I always made sure that I was able to say, and I spoke to that person about that as well. And that has been taken care of, and you feel free to talk to him about it. But we're here to talk about you. And then, you know, I would focus it back. But, you know, the important thing when you're out and you're trying to have confrontational conversations with people, you know, things that you know they're not going to like but need to be said, you know, it's very important that you understand that they're going to look at what you've done in the past to other people because that's just the way people operate. So really, it's important for you and I to establish this particular rule in all of our affairs, so people who aren't involved see it, right?
That's a very good point, JT.
Yeah, I think it's super important for us to do. All right, so question number 2. Let's go into the mental aspect. And what I just said probably applies a little bit to this, but what is a good way to apply ourselves mentally when someone does us wrong? So, what's that mental process for us?
I think the first thing that should pop up in our minds mentally, ding, ding, ding. Point number 1, pray for them. Pray for that person.
Yeah,
okay?
There you go.
Jesus even said, I say to you, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of the Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun to rise on the evil and on the good. He sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? And do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? You do even like the Gentiles do. They do the same. So the bottom line is, if you're praying for a person, your whole perspective changes. I mean, I'm talking about praying for them, not praying imprecatory prayers on them. So, yeah, that's an important thing to do.
Yeah, the precatory prayer thing, man, that's definitely something that we need to keep an eye out on, right?
Yeah, I mean, those were given for a specific time, and actually, as I've studied the book of Psalms, where you'll read those imprecatory prayers of David, that more than likely they were there for a purpose that even as David was lamenting over his situation, that was the time when he was also praying those imprecatory prayers, like praying that God would snuff out that person once and for all.
Well, something, I think if we're all honest with ourselves, we all have a tendency to do that. I mean, there are some people that for some reason just can put us in that zone to where we're like, rain fire down on that dude as quickly as you can. Like, it's just in our heart. But the important thing is that's not when I'm going to go confront that guy.
That's exactly right.
Right.
By the way, speaking of that, it was John the apostle of love. He and his brother wanted to rain down fire on people that were not walking with the Lord Jesus Christ.
Yes, the sons of thunder, as they were called.
The sons
right?
of thunder. Yeah. That's right. You do think he learned his lesson? I think he did.
Yeah, I'm quite sure. Yeah. It's a very different John that we see on the island of Patmos, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, let's go to question number 3, which is from the physical aspect. And this was a question from a listener, if I remember correctly. So we are asked often if there's a difference, like between walking or running on a treadmill and running and walking outside or on trails or on the roads. There is a difference, but what do you say about that? Like when somebody comes to you, because I think what they're looking for is kind of a definitive on this is better and this is why. What do you say to that?
Well, obviously it's personal preference, and it all depends how much time you have and your locale and what the weather's like, if you're willing to run out in the rain or in the snow and in the mud. A treadmill does have advantages at this time of the year if you don't like walking or running in the cold or, as I mentioned, in the rain or in the snow or in the mud. But if your time is very short, it's good to be able to squeeze in a workout just if you have a treadmill. I used to have one of those fancy treadmills. Do you still have that?
Oh, yeah. No. Hey, yeah. It's funny. This time of year, it actually gets a workout from our neighbors, too. Like, they'll come over if it's too cold and be like, hey, can we use your treadmill? So, yeah, it's funny.
It's JT's gym here. Well, the road does have advantages. It makes you have to adjust to multiple terrains, which is good for your system. It's good for your brain to have to adjust uneven trail. Also, the trail likewise has its advantages, of course, because there's the added challenge of not only balance but up and down terrain. Right?
Yeah, that's a big thing. Yes.
Yes, it is, and especially out where you live. Treadmill, though, workouts can get boring, so outside can be an advantage just to be able to see new scenery. I think that's why you like going down the mountains on your mountain bike. And of course, there are obstacles to consider on the road and the trail that you may have to work to avoid, such as JT avoids the mud. But of course, if you have one of those fancy treadmills that provides scenery, and you still have unique challenges on that fancy treadmill, don't you?
Yeah, so basically the way this one works in particular, and most of them I think do this, ones that have screens, is you basically pick a run and there's a host on the screen and they're running usually in some place a lot prettier than where you are, especially if you're in a gym. And basically when they're going uphill, your treadmill adjusts to where it goes up in elevation or it declines or does whatever. It was funny because when I was preparing for 5Ks when I was younger, one of the things that I always made sure I did if I was inside on a treadmill was I made sure that I always had at least a 5% grade on the treadmill. Oh. And what that did was it just made it to where it was a little bit more difficult because I did notice a difference. If I just ran flat on a treadmill, I noticed that it was distinctly harder to run outside. Now, that wasn't just that it was up and down. There was also wind resistance. There's all kinds of other things going on. But it does do the same thing, like you said. I mean, if you want to burn calories, if you want to get a workout, if you want to exercise your muscles, indoor or outdoor, my friend, don't matter.
Yeah. Bottom line is calories are basically the same, although you may burn more outside when it's cooler just to keep your core temperature up. But nevertheless, it's basically the same. But then the thing is just do it. And that takes discipline, JT.
It does.
And as we always say, discipline makes the difference in all aspects of life. Check out today's show notes at bobbrubaker.com. Click on the Power Break podcast. Today is show number 238.
And submit your questions by email to jt@bobbrubaker.com, and we'll get to answering your question on an upcoming Power Break podcast.
Quick word for Relief in Suffering. That's the book we're talking about. You'll find it at bobbrubaker.com. Check it out today.
Well, thank you for joining us for the Power Break podcast. Please subscribe and leave a review wherever you've downloaded the podcast, and check out news, show notes, Bob's weekly blog, and other cool things at bobbrubaker.com. And listen next time for the Power Break podcast.